Think the Middle Ages were a time of pure chastity, cloistered monks, and young women obediently waiting for arranged marriages. The story we inherit paints medieval society as restrained and morally upright, a world where desire was suffocated by religion. But peel back the illusion, and what you find is stranger, more contradictory, and often far more shocking. Beneath the hymns and sermons, people were inventing customs so awkward, so bizarre, that they almost defy belief. One of the most peculiar was called bundling. Imagine yourself as a young man in a small rural village. Your parents have arranged a potential match. Instead of a candlelit walk or quiet conversation, you're led to a bed. There, your would-be partner lies waiting. You're not alone, your parents and hers are probably nearby. You're placed side by side, tied together in a thick sack or wrapped so tightly in cloth you can barely move. Between you rests a long wooden board, the so-called bundling plank, meant to keep bodies from touching. And thus begins your courtship. It sounds like satire, but it was real. Families across Northern Europe, especially in remote farming communities, embraced bundling as a kind of supervised intimacy. They believed it allowed young couples to get to know each other while protecting virginity. Parents themselves encouraged the practice, even manufacturing special bundling bags designed for the purpose. It became an industry of restraint, a medieval solution to desire place. Two people in bed, lock them in fabric, and hope virtue will prevail. But of course, human nature had other plans. The records that survive, especially from New England, where bundling traveled with European settlers, reveal an irony that would make any priest's head shake. Pregnancy rates among bundling couples were consistently higher than those courting through traditional means. The reason is obvious. Put two hormonal young people together in the dark, and no amount of planks or ropes can prevent what comes naturally. The church fought hard against bundling. Priests railed from pulpits, condemning it as immoral, a gateway to temptation, a direct violation of God's law. But the habit was so deeply woven into village life that it proved nearly impossible to eradicate. For rural families, bundling was both practical and symbolic. Practical because houses where small beds were few, and supervised sleepovers were easier than constant chaperoning. Symbolic because it demonstrated parental authority. They could allow closeness while pretending to preserve chastity. It was in many ways the medieval version of today's paradoxical parenting, condemning social media while handing children a smartphone, warning against temptation while enabling it. The contradictions of human behavior were as alive in the 14th century as they are in the 21st. Bundling was supposed to guard virtue. Instead, it quietly undermined it. Young men and women who emerged from those cloth prisons often carried not just memories of awkward nights, but sometimes children as well. For all the sermons, bundling proved that when human desire clashes with human rules, desire usually wins. If bundling showed the awkward side of medieval intimacy, their obsession with food revealed the extravagant, almost ritualistic lengths people went to in pursuit of desire. In a world where medicine was primitive and religious rules suffocated personal freedom, food became the secret weapon of seduction. But this wasn't about strawberries dipped in chocolate or a glass of champagne. No, the medieval table was loaded with dishes so grotesque, so bizarre, that to us they feel closer to a carnival of superstition than a dinner. At the heart of it all were animal testicles. Bulls, rams, boars, if it had a reputation for virility, its organs ended up in the kitchen. They were roasted, boiled, fried, powdered, and dissolved in wine. They even had a polite name for them stones, as if dressing the word indignity could hide the crude reality. The belief was simple: consume the organs of the strong, and their strength would transfer into your body. It was sympathetic magic turned into haute cuisine. But testicles were only the beginning. Medieval physicians and cooks who often worked hand in hand recommended sparrow brains, goat reproductive organs, even concoctions made from marrow and blood. Each ingredient carried symbolic weight. Birds were seen as passionate and tireless, so their brains were thought to ignite the same fire in humans. Spices, too, became central. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, saffron ingredients that merchants carried across continents, sold for their weight in gold, were believed not just to flavor meals, but to inflame lust. To sprinkle saffron into a dish was to purchase desire itself. Underlying all of this was the medieval theory of humors that the body was governed by 4 fluids: blood phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and that desire, health, and fertility depended on keeping them in balance. Foods were carefully classified as hot or cold, moist or dry, and aphrodisiac feasts were designed to heat the blood, quicken the body, and rouse sexual appetite. When nobles hosted such gatherings, they weren't just entertaining. They were practicing medicine, or so they believed. The most astonishing part is where these feasts often appeared wedding banquets. Imagine being a guest seated at a long wooden table, while servants parade platters of animal genitals, roasted sparrows, and spiced wine. This was no mere indulgence. It was preparation. The purpose was to ensure that the marriage sealed in public ceremony would be sealed again in private, and produce heirs without delay. Even the wedding cake itself was packed with stimulating ingredients: almonds, for fertility, pine nuts, for potency, honey for passion. It was less dessert than prescription. And these recipes were not whispers passed in secret kitchens. We still have the manuscript's texts with titles like "On the Generation of Semen" and "Foods That Increase Lust." They were studied by scholars and physicians, copied by scribes, and treated as legitimate science. In some cases, the church even banned certain ingredients during fasting seasons, not because they spoiled virtue of the stomach, but because they inflamed the body in ways that distracted from the soul. Picture it a society where spices were hoarded like treasures, where wedding guests dined on dishes designed not for taste, but for stimulation, and where entire cookbooks were devoted to the art of lust. This was the medieval bedroom disguised as a dining hall, and every bite was charged with expectation. If the feasts of desire shocked you, the next ritual strips away any illusion of intimacy. Imagine being newly married in the medieval world. The bells of the church have just rung, the vows have been spoken, the feast has ended. But your marriage is not yet real. Not until it is consummated, and consummation must be proven. Enter the bedding ceremony. To us, it feels like a nightmare. But to medieval nobles, it was a matter of law, politics, and inheritance. Marriage was not simply the union of 2 hearts. It was a contract binding families' lands and wealth. If the union produced no heir, dynasties could collapse, alliances could dissolve, wars could erupt. And so the act of sex itself became a public obligation. After the wedding, the bride and groom would be led by a procession of relatives, priests, and nobles into their bedchamber. The bride was undressed by her female kin, the groom by his male relatives, gendered rituals meant to preserve a veneer of propriety. Then, in full view, the couple was placed in bed together. Witnesses didn't simply peek to confirm. They stayed, sometimes offering encouragement, sometimes even prayers. Some chronicles speak of laughter, jeering, even chants, as if this most private of moments had become theater. And when it was done, the bedclothes themselves were inspected. Blood on the sheets was considered proof of virginity and consummation. No blood, no proof, and in some cases, no marriage. Court records survive of unions annulled because the bedding ceremony was incomplete or the evidence unsatisfactory. For those couples, intimacy had to be performed again, this time correctly, with witnesses present. It wasn't only kings and queens who suffered this humiliation. Any marriage involving dowries, estates, or political contracts could demand a witnessed consummation. Manuals of etiquette even described how to behave as a guest in such ceremonies, where to stand, what to say, how long to stay, before leaving the couple in privacy. It was voyeurism institutionalized, codified into law and culture. And yet within the absurdity lay cold logic. Medieval society feared false heirs, children not truly of a noble bloodline, but passed off as such. The bedding ceremony was insurance proof against betrayal and protection of lineage. It was not about love, it was about legacy. So while today we toast the bride and groom and leave them to their privacy, the medieval world demanded spectacle. A marriage was not real until bodies proved what words and rings could not. And in that demand, we see the harsh truth of the age desire was never just personal, it was political. For medieval aristocrats, even sex was scheduled like a military campaign. It wasn't enough to have a spouse, a bed, or even desire. To produce heirs, the lifeblood of dynasties, one needed timing calculation and divine approval. Conception was less an act of passion than a ritual of logistics. The guidebooks of the age, written by physicians and astrologers, laid out the rules. Children should be conceived beneath the waxing moon when its growth symbolized fertility. The stars had to be properly aligned planets in favorable houses, the air warm and humid. Even the bed's direction mattered east toward the rising sun to encourage strong suns west if one risked daughters. Couples studied the heavens as if the cosmos itself kept ledgers of fertility. Astrology wasn't entertainment. It was science as medieval people understood it. Learned physicians used Galenic medicine, the theory of four humors, to decide when a woman's body was hot enough to conceive. A woman too cold in temperament, they said, could not carry life. A man too damp in his humors risked producing weak or sickly children. The balance of fluids and the movement of stars had to align before two bodies could meet. Religion made things even more suffocating. The church declared entire swaths of the calendar off limits, no sex on Sundays, Fridays, or Wednesdays. None during Lent or Advent. None during menstruation, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. By some estimates, more than half the days in a year were forbidden. That left couples scrambling for narrow windows when passion was permitted. To disobey was to risk sin, even damnation. Among the wealthy specialists emerged part priest, part doctor, part astrologer. Families paid these fertility consultants to draw up schedules of intimacy, noting which nights were auspicious, which days dangerous. It was the medieval version of a fertility app, except written on parchment and drenched in superstition. One noblewoman might be instructed to conceive only after St. John's feast, while another was told to wait for spring rains to moisten the air. The sheer detail was staggering. And then there was gender selection. Manuals advised men to tie off their left testicle if they wanted a son, since sons supposedly came from the right. Others recommended particular sexual positions, diets heavy in red meat or almonds, or prayers whispered in Latin at the critical moment. Each absurd ritual reveals a deeper truth in an age when dynasties depended on heirs. The bedroom was a battlefield of anxiety, science, faith, and desperation. Some couples even traveled miles to conceive in the right place, believing geography could alter fate. Imagine a lord and lady packing up their household just to ensure their child would be conceived under a lucky sky. It sounds insane, yet it shows how deeply inheritance weighed on every bedchamber. Medieval people believed they were guided by God and the cosmos, but in truth, they were prisoners of fear. Fear of infertility, fear of sin, fear of leaving their line without an heir. And so what should have been an act of intimacy became a choreographed performance plotted by priests, dictated by stars, and judged by society. If astrology turned the stars into guardians of fertility, the medieval wardrobe turned clothing into charms of conception. In an age where every object could be infused with magic or divine blessing, even underwear was transformed into a weapon in the struggle for heirs. The most famous of these talismans was the girdle of Venus. Not a poetic metaphor, but a literal belt woven of silk or linen inscribed with prayers, symbols, and fragments of scripture. Worn tight around the waist or hips, it was said to safeguard childbirth, enhance pleasure, and above all, guarantee fertility. Some girdles bore images of saints, others mystical diagrams, as if a combination of holy verse and hidden geometry could coax the womb into life. Women clung to them as lifelines, convinced their bodies were vessels that needed spiritual armor. But belts were only the beginning. Wealthy women carried amulets filled with powdered gemstones or fragments of so-called unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, imported at great expense from northern seas. Some pressed sapphires against their bellies to conceive daughters, emeralds for sons, and diamonds for twins. Poorer women improvised with local stones, sometimes carving symbols into river pebbles to wear against their skin. Each rock was a promise, however flimsy, that fate could be persuaded. The strangest device was the conception stone, a small crystal slipped discreetly into one's undergarments during sex believed to channel fertility directly into the act. Imagine the discomfort, the awkwardness, and yet the desperate hope. To deny such practices was unthinkable. After all, the failure to produce children could end a marriage, destroy alliances, even invite exile. For women, these objects were less superstition than survival. Men, too, had their arsenal. Rings worn on certain fingers, charms filled with animal organs, always testicles the medieval obsession, or linen loincloths blessed by priests to ensure potency. Virility was not left to chance. Like women, men bore the weight of proving their bodies worthy of lineage, and they sought comfort in rituals as bizarre as they were humiliating. The church predictably saw opportunity. Priests blessed belts, amulets, even bed linens, charging fees for their holy services. Monasteries sold relics said to ensure fertility, turning desire into revenue. It was in effect a spiritual subscription service: pay, pray, and hope the miracle arrives. Surviving manuscripts even contain instructions for how to wear certain girdles and which prayers to recite if they stopped working, an early form of customer support for magical underwear. For the wealthy, these items were luxuries: belts embroidered with gold, lined with silk from China, studded with imported gems. For peasants, they were rough copies, fashioned from cloth and wood. Thus, a hierarchy emerged, not just in castles or courts, but in the bedroom itself. Fertility accessories became another badge of class marking: who could afford divine protection, and who had to make do with superstition. Behind it all lies a chilling truth: intimacy was never private. Every gesture, every ritual, every garment was charged with fear. Fear of infertility, fear of failure, fear of a family line ending in disgrace. Sex, already bound by law and religion, was further shackled by charms, belts, and stones. In the medieval world, to make love was never simply to love. It was to negotiate with God, bargain with nature, and hedge one's future with talismans. If magical belts and jeweled amulets were the tools of hope, impotence trials were the theater of despair. In a world where the church forbade divorce, claiming your husband could not perform in bed was one of the very few escape routes for women. But freedom came at a terrible price: the total exposure of one's most private life to the cold scrutiny of judges, priests, and neighbors. The process began with humiliation. A couple accused of impotence was summoned to court, where physicians armed with little more than superstition examined their bodies. They searched for signs of deformity, weakness, or unnatural coldness. They asked explicit questions about frequency, arousal, even positions attempted. Every detail of intimacy was dragged into the open, documented, and debated. When doubt remained, the court resorted to its most grotesque weapon, the trial by Congress. Ordered by decree, husband and wife were locked in a chamber, prepared by officials, sometimes inside the courthouse itself. Judges, doctors, and clerks watched from behind curtains or peepholes, waiting to see if the man could achieve an erection, penetrate, and complete the act. What was meant to prove virility became public theater, a performance on which dignity, marriage, and reputation all hinged. Imagine the pressure. A man stripped of privacy, knowing failure would condemn him, while an audience of scholars and clerics whispered on the other side of the wall. Desperate, some smuggled potions or herbs, medieval versions of Viagra, only to be caught and further shamed. Others refused outright, preferring annulment to the agony of repeated failure in front of witnesses. For some, the spectacle dragged on for months, even years, with multiple performances demanded until the court was satisfied. And women were not spared. Those who sought annulment had to prove they were willing and capable partners. They endured invasive examinations, probing questions about their own responses, even insinuations that a man's impotence might be their fault. Too cold, too unattractive, too unenthusiastic, the blame could fall anywhere. What began as a plea for freedom often ended as a trial of character. The social consequences were brutal. Gossip spread quickly in towns and villages, and no one involved escaped unscathed. Husbands labeled impotent lived with permanent disgrace. Wives accused of exaggeration carried suspicion for years, and families bore the stain of scandal. Even those who won often lost because their names became synonymous with shame. In these trials, the medieval world exposed its cruel paradox. It preached chastity and virtue, yet dragged people's sex lives into the public square. It declared marriage sacred, yet tore it apart through grotesque spectacles. Behind the absurd rituals lay the same human desperation we saw in bundling and fertility charms, a hunger for control in a world where nature, desire, and fate so often defied it. If impotence trials laid bare private humiliation, the church's role in prostitution exposed public hypocrisy. Medieval clergy preached purity from pulpits, but in practice, they managed one of Europe's largest sex industries. In 12th century London, the Bishop of Winchester himself oversaw licensed brothels, collecting rents from keepers and taxes from women. Records show more than 1,000 prostitutes operating legally under church authority. It was an institution within an institution, sin repackaged as necessity. The logic was chilling. Prostitution, clerics argued, was a necessary evil. Better men visit brothels than corrupt the sanctity of noble women, or worse, fall into unnatural sin. So the church regulated the trade, imposing dress codes, restricting work to designated districts, forbidding labor on holy days. The profits flowed upward from prostitute to madam, from madam to landlord, from landlord to bishop. Money earned in the trade of bodies built churches, funded monasteries, and lit candles on altars. Salvation, in effect, was financed by sin. And yet, when reformers later tried to shut these brothels down, resistance was fierce. Too many pockets depended on their revenue. Too many reputations entwined with their existence. It was only centuries later, under Protestant pressure and changing morality, that the hypocrisy grew impossible to defend. But for hundreds of years, Europe's holiest men quietly held the strings of its unholiest trade. If the church's brothels reveal corruption, medieval contraception shows desperation. Faced with limited choices and constant fear of pregnancy, women resorted to methods that ranged from useless to deadly. Some wore amulets of weasel testicles, believing the animal's promiscuity, yet small litters would pass unrestrained. Others drank potions of iron filings, mercury, or ground-up animal organs, concoctions that poisoned more than they protected. There were stranger methods still. Women inserted honey-soaked wool, or according to some records, crocodile dung as barriers against conception. A few sliced lemons into crude cervical caps, painful, but at least somewhat effective. Others relied on timing, though tragically inverted, convinced women were most fertile. During menstruation, couples thought mid-cycle encounters safe. They were, of course, exactly wrong. Then came magical rituals, sneezing immediately after sex to expel semen circling churches backwards, while reciting incantations burying herbs under moonlight. Some wore stones in their undergarments, convinced gems could sway destiny. Even withdrawal, the one method that might have worked, was dismissed as dangerous, said to cause madness or even death for men. Looking back, it is easy to laugh at the absurdity belts inscribed with prayers, judges watching couples in bed, bishops profiting from brothels, women clutching amulets of bone. Yet beneath the strangeness lies something uncomfortably familiar. Human beings across centuries grasp for control over the uncontrollable love, desire, fertility, faith. When institutions restrict, people find loopholes. When knowledge fails, superstition rushes in. The medieval world, for all its bizarre customs, was not so different from ours. Their tools were stones and charms. Ours are apps and medicine. They feared infertility and scandal. We fear the same, only cloaked in modern terms. They blurred the line between faith and hypocrisy. We still wrestle with those contradictions today. The Middle Ages remind us that sexuality is never just about bodies. It is about power, belief survival, and the endless human attempt to bend nature to will. And in that struggle, awkward, tragic, and sometimes absurd, we see not just medieval people, but ourselves.